Raised by a rival. My life with a mom-ster. Hey everyone, I spend so much time finding these stories for you. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world and help this channel going strong. Let's grow together now. Let's start the video. I was born into a fairly well-off family in a South Asian country. Now, in my early 40s, I look back and realize how much that upbringing shaped me. My dad's a doctor, and my mom is a housewife, just like a lot of families in our culture. I was the firstborn daughter, which came with its own set of expectations and challenges. Growing up, I found myself mirroring a lot of my mother's struggles. She was stuck in an unhappy marriage, an arranged one at that. It wasn't that she had someone on the side, it's just that she wasn't happy with my father. She had dreams of having a baby boy, someone she could shower with love and who might one day take care of her, providing her with security and comfort. I think she thought that having a son would somehow make her life better, giving her the best quality of life that she wanted. When I came along instead, her disappointment was palpable. I can still feel it in my bones, the way she treated me because of her unfulfilled hopes. My earliest memories are like snapshots from a movie I never wanted to be in. I remember being just a toddler, probably around 3 or 4 years old, desperately craving my mom's love and attention. But every time I reached out for her, she would push me away, her frustration boiling over. I cried for her, needing a hug or just some warmth, but it was like I was invisible to her. Those moments felt so heavy and hurtful, and I can't help but carry that emotional weight with me even now. My mother never wanted to give me anything nice. Good food? Forget it. Toys? Absolutely not. She always discouraged my father from spending money on me, insisting it was all a waste and that he should save for the next baby. So, I had to get creative. I started playing with cardboard boxes, making origami, and turning them into all sorts of makeshift toys. Honestly, I found so much joy in it. I wasn't sad about not having the latest gadgets or fancy toys. I was having fun using my imagination. As for snacks, she never indulged me with chocolates or those sugary treats that most kids loved. Instead, I grew up munching on cherry tomatoes and colorful vegetables. You know what? I actually loved them. So in a way, she did something good for me. Not that it was intentional. She just didn't want to waste money on snacks or toys, but it worked out. With no toys to play with besides the origami I crafted, I found a real passion for art. I started drawing and painting a lot, and I was actually pretty good at it. My father, seeing my talent, would buy me all sorts of art supplies, watercolors, pastels, everything I needed to create. But my mom, she absolutely hated it. I'll never forget the time she lost it and burned all my art materials, yelling at my father for wasting money on things she thought were pointless. It hurt so much to see my creations go up in flames, but somehow, it only fueled my determination to keep creating, even if it meant sneaking in my art whenever she wasn't around. There are so many little incidents like these that stick with me, shaping the way I remember my childhood. One vivid memory is how my mom rarely took me to school. The only times she did were on the very first day, and then again when one of our house helpers was away on holiday. I remember the excitement of seeing her that day. I rushed over to her, jumping with joy like any kid would when their parent shows up. I ran up to her and threw my arms around her, expecting a warm hug in return, but instead, she pushed me away. In that moment, my heart sank. I felt a mix of sadness and confusion, but I never hated her for it. Deep down, I still loved her. She was my mom, after all. I didn't fully understand the pain she was going through in her marriage and how that affected her treatment of me. I just saw her as my mother, trying to navigate her own unhappiness. As I grew older, I began to see the bigger picture of her struggles and why she acted the way she did. Despite everything, the neglect, the hurt, the pushbacks, I never carried hatred in my heart. There was always a flicker of love for her, a yearning for the connection that seemed so elusive. That's the complicated nature of our relationship. Hurt intertwined with love, understanding mixed with confusion. Even as I reflect on those times, I realize I still held on to that love, hoping for something more. My mom had always dreamed of having a baby boy, and when I was about 3 or 4 years old, her dream came true. But it was short-lived. My baby brother only lived for a week. He passed away from complications due to pneumonia, and it devastated my mom. I was heartbroken too. I was so excited to finally have a baby brother to play with. But instead, I was left with grief. And for some reason, she blamed me. She said I was the bad luck for the family, that if I hadn't been born first, maybe things would have been different. I took a lot of heat for that during that time, and looking back, I understand her pain. She had lost something so precious to her, and in her mind, I was somehow the cause of that loss. I never hated her for it, though. I still loved her, even in her darkest moments. It's funny how love can stick around through all the hurt. But I think that's just how I was wired. Years passed, and things never really got better. My mom's treatment of me grew worse as I got older. When I was around 7 or 8, my brother was finally born, the baby boy she had wanted so badly. And well, that's when everything changed. It was like I didn't exist anymore. All the attention and care went to him, but I didn't mind at first. I understood. He was a little baby and needed more attention than me. I could handle myself. At least that's what I told myself. As my brother grew, so did the disparity. By the time he was 3 or 4, he started getting all the good stuff. My mom never gave me chicken, and that used to bug me because I loved it, but I never got it. She would always give it to my brother, and I used to be annoyed about it. Not because of the chicken, but because it was another thing that made me feel invisible. She'd give me fish instead and heaps of veggies. She would load my brother up with protein, saying, "He's a boy, he needs more protein than you." Meals were scarce for me. I'd get something decent maybe once every 6 to 8 weeks, while my brother always had the good stuff. If I ever tried to ask for a piece of meat, she'd shut me down with a sharp, "Don't even think about it. It's for your brother." But honestly, I didn't care. I was happy with whatever I got, even if it wasn't much. Again, I never hated my mom for this. I never hated my brother for getting more than I did either. I don't even know if I felt resentment. Maybe I just accepted it as my reality. It wasn't perfect, but I wasn't going to let it define me. As my brother and I grew up, the love I once had for my mom began to fade, especially as I hit my teenage years. It wasn't that I hated her. I just felt this emptiness where that love used to be. It slowly disappeared as I watched her channel all her attention and affection toward my brother. Everything was for him. The food, the clothes, the comfort, whatever you could think of, he got it. I never asked for much. Just the basics would have made me happy. But even that felt like a struggle. During my period, it was the worst. I was a heavy bleeder and needed at least 3 pads a day, but my mom would only give me 1. It had to last a full 24 hours, which was beyond uncomfortable. I dreaded those days, knowing I had to make do with just 1 pad while dealing with such heavy bleeding. I remember one particular night when we had guests over for dinner. I was helping my mom in the kitchen, and the discomfort became unbearable. I begged her for just 1 more pad, explaining that I couldn't hold out any longer after being in school all day. But she yelled at me, saying, "No, go help the guests at the table." There I was, struggling to stand upright, and then it happened. Blood started running down my skirt. I felt so embarrassed, especially when one of the guests noticed and went to talk to my mom about it. Her response? "You embarrass me." Comfort was never in the cards for me. It was all for my brother, the golden child she was grooming to be the best version of himself. She had high hopes for him, dreams of becoming a doctor or an engineer, going to study in the US, getting citizenship, and then one day sponsoring my mom to move there. That was her plan. On top of that, I found out she was planning an escape to the US under my uncle's sponsorship. She wanted to take only my brother with her, leaving me behind. I overheard a fight between my parents about it one day. My dad said something about me, and my mom snapped. I didn't catch all of it, but I heard her say she didn't want to take me, that it would just be her and my brother. Her application was nearly approved, about 90% done, when tragedy struck. My uncle passed away from cancer, and just like that, her plans fell apart. And guess who she blamed? Me. I was always the bad luck for the family in her eyes. As I grew older, I stopped feeling anything for her. It wasn't hate. It was more like I had emotionally detached myself. I was exhausted from the ignorance and neglect. I just couldn't take it anymore. I focused on my studies, determined to carve my own path. I promised myself that one day I would get out of this place and start my own life away from this family. My dad was never really in the picture either. He was always working, so we never developed that father-daughter bond. I didn't hold any resentment toward either of them. I just accepted that this was my reality and did my best to make peace with it. I knew I couldn't beg for their love. Love should come naturally, not be forced. During my teenage years, as I started to distance myself emotionally from my mother, her treatment of me only intensified. She made it clear that she felt I was worthless, and I knew part of it was because I was a girl in the family. She constantly compared me to her nephews and nieces, talking about how talented and accomplished they were. Some were singers, some writers, others even became TV stars. Meanwhile, I felt like I was just existing, doing my own thing, and it seemed like none of that was ever enough for her. I've always been an introvert, preferring to keep to myself rather than mixing with people. My interests didn't align with the cultural skills she valued. I found joy in art, drawing and painting, but even that passion was stifled. Despite her attempts to crush my spirit, like when she burned my art books and destroyed my colored pencils and pastels, I refused to give up. I picked up regular pencils and continued to draw, pouring my emotions into my drawing. It was a way for me to express myself, even if it felt like my mom wanted to erase that part of me. While she saw my solitude as a flaw, I found comfort in it. Creating art was my escape, my way of reclaiming my identity in a world where I felt undervalued. I didn't need her approval to pursue what made me happy, and slowly, that realization became my strength. I kept nurturing my interests and developing my skills, finding joy in the art that she couldn't take away from me. Honestly, it felt like whatever I wanted in my life, my mom was hell-bent on destroying it. She'd go out of her way to make sure I didn't get what I wanted. Like, I had this affair with one of my classmates, and she was not having it. She straight up told me I had to leave him. But I was like, nah, I love this guy, and I'm not going anywhere. Well, because I didn't bow to her demands, she decided to go all out and visit this voodoo astrologer. Apparently, he did some kind of magic on me, and next thing I knew, I was breaking up with my boyfriend. I don't even believe in that stuff, but something about it seemed to work. We started having problems, and before I could wrap my head around it, we were done, and then it happened again. I got into another relationship thinking it would be different, but nope, my mom found out. And you guessed it. She went back to that same astrologer, did her thing, and I ended up breaking up with him too. It was like she had some kind of hold over my love life, and every time I tried to stand my ground, something would happen that made me question everything. That second breakup hit me hard. I was shattered. But I knew I had to stay strong, especially with my mother's old nonsense weighing on me. I was done with it. I longed to leave the country, to pursue my studies overseas and finally carve out a life for myself, away from all the negativity. But of course, my mother wasn't having it. She was quick to remind me that my father wouldn't be giving me any financial support and that I'd have to figure it all out on my own. I remember thinking, I can do this? Still, she kept pushing against my plans, insisting I should just stay, get married, and settle down instead. It felt like she couldn't see my dreams, only her own expectations for me. Despite her discouragement, I managed to talk to my father. Surprisingly, he agreed to cover my initial costs for studying abroad, but I had to promise to pay him back when I could. That was a big deal for me. It felt like a small victory. My mother, on the other hand, was furious. She wanted all the financial resources saved for my brother when his time came to go overseas, as she had been planning for him. In that moment, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. I had taken a step toward independence, but it came at the cost of my mother's approval, which I had already learned to live without. I knew this was my chance to break free from the mold she wanted me to fit into, and I was determined to make it work, no matter how much resistance I faced. Moving to Australia in my early 20s was a huge step for me, especially since my father had helped cover my initial costs and part of my tuition fees. I threw myself into my studies and worked multiple part-time jobs, often pulling double shifts. I wanted to pay my father back as quickly as I could, not just out of obligation, but because my mother was constantly nagging me about it. Every day, it felt like all she wanted to know was when I would pay him back, completely ignoring how I was adapting to life in a new country. Once I finally paid my father back, it was as if I had vanished from her thoughts. She hardly reached out anymore, only calling when she needed something, typically money. I was a student working part-time, so my finances were tight, and I had tuition fees to manage. When she insisted on a new mobile phone, I reluctantly agreed to send one. I returned home briefly in 2011 to sort out some passport paperwork and brought back 2 smartphones, one for my mother and one for my father. It was just a week-long visit, and as soon as I completed my tasks, I returned to Australia to continue my studies. In the meantime, I started a relationship with my Australian boyfriend, which my parents were somewhat supportive of, advising me to focus on my studies first. Things were going well until my mother began to undermine it. She kept telling me I wouldn't last long with him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was doing something behind the scenes to stir up trouble. Sure enough, after 7 years in Australia, I had to come back home due to a major breakdown in the relationship. It felt like everything had changed overnight. There had been no real issues between us until suddenly it all fell apart. On my last day before returning home, it was very tough, but I knew I had to be strong. I was preparing to leave, and instead of asking me how I was doing or how my time had been, my mother asked, "What are you bringing for me from Australia? What? Electronics or cosmetics?" I couldn't believe it. Here I was, ending a significant chapter of my life, and she was only focused on what I could give her. I told her I would see what I could get, but I didn't have much money. Her priorities were crystal clear, and it hurt to realize that after everything I had been through, her interest in me was still mostly transactional. So, after coming back from Australia, I was thrown back into the same old craziness with my family. My mom was still obsessing over my brother, acting like he was the golden child while I was just kind of there. It felt like no matter what I did, she'd find a way to make me feel less than, always comparing me to my cousins who seemed to have their lives all figured out. I just wanted to focus on my own stuff, but it was like she was a constant cloud of negativity hanging over me. I dove into job hunting after I graduated, but every rejection felt like a punch to the gut, and my mom's voice was echoing in my head, telling me I'd never make it. It was exhausting. I started to wonder if she had some kind of voodoo magic, working against me because it seemed like every time I tried to get ahead, something would trip me up. So growing up, my brother was a total enigma. He was this bright, talented kid who had everything going for him, but when he hit his teenage years, he flipped the script. Suddenly, he was being rude as hell to my mom, calling her names, being aggressive, the whole 9 yards. I couldn't figure out why. She gave him all the love and attention she could muster, but he was just nasty. Things got even crazier when he moved to the US for his studies. It's like being away just fueled the fire. I mean, this kid was a genius, destined for great things, but he harbored this insane hatred for my mom. It honestly shocked me. She, desperate to fix things, went to this astrologer who promised to help with some voodoo magic. For a little while, it seemed to work. He chilled out and was nice to her. But when that astrologer passed away, it was like the spell was broken. He went right back to his rude, distant ways, ignoring her calls and not bothering to reach out. When I went back home from Australia, I had a huge fight with him, and I decided I was done with it. We stopped talking, and I made peace with that. His behavior was just unacceptable, and I didn't want to deal with it anymore. Eventually, I decided enough was enough and made the leap to Canada for my master's. I told my mom straight up that I wasn't going to ask for any cash from my dad. I wanted to do this on my own. I thought it would be a fresh start, and honestly, I needed to get away from all the drama back home. When I got to Canada, it was a grind. I juggled a ton of part-time jobs just to keep my head above water while studying. There were nights I barely slept because I was hustling so hard, but all that effort paid off. I finally landed a full-time gig. It wasn't exactly what I dreamed of, but it was a paycheck, and it allowed me to start saving. Fast forward a bit, and I pulled off a huge win. I bought my first apartment outright. No mortgage. I was thrilled. But of course, I didn't tell my mom. I knew she'd find a way to ruin it with her negativity toward me and the fact that she always seems to consult that astrologer guy to somehow mess things up for me. In the midst of all this, I got into a new relationship. I kept my parents in the loop because I figured, why not? But my mom, being who she is, was like, "You're not gonna last long with him." Classic. I couldn't help but thought about it that she would do something again to ruin I, but I was like, whatever. I've been through too much to let anyone else dictate my happiness. As time went on, I noticed some red flags. With my boyfriend, he seemed to be coasting along, relying on me more than I'd expected. It started to make me question everything. Like, was I falling back into old patterns? I was determined not to let anyone mess with my hard-earned happiness, though. Each argument felt like a reminder to focus on myself. I'd been through too much to let anyone hold me back, including him. It was hard, but I kept telling myself that my life was finally my own, and I was determined to create a future that I genuinely wanted, far away from my mom's shadow and her expectations. Honestly, I have a feeling this relationship with him will end soon too. But I don't care anymore. I'm completely over it. Meanwhile, my mom was left feeling hopeless and started searching for another astrologer because of the tension building up between her and my brother. She finally found someone new and went to him for a reading, hoping that he could do some voodoo to make my brother talk to my mom again. He did readings for our whole family, including me, and when my mom told me what he said, it got really interesting. He mentioned that I had a big enemy in the family, and I immediately knew who he was talking about: my own mother. It was wild to hear that from a stranger who didn't know our history. Even though I've completely detached from my mom emotionally, it was hard not to see her suffering because of how my brother treated her. He wouldn't pick up her calls, wouldn't even acknowledge her existence. One day she asked me if I'd cursed her. I was taken aback and asked why she'd think that. She went on about how she always treated him better, gave him the best of everything while I got the scraps, and now look at her situation. I told her straight up, "Why would I curse you? You're my mom." Sure, we've had our issues, but I never hated her. I don't love her the way I did when I was a kid, but I don't wish her any harm. Honestly, it's kind of amusing to me how my brother has totally dissed her, and now she's desperately begging for his attention. What did I do? Nothing. So here I am telling my story, not for sympathy, but for understanding, for anyone who's ever felt invisible, unworthy, or unloved. For anyone who's ever struggled to escape the shadow of someone who should have loved them but couldn't. You are not alone, and you are stronger than you know.